Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to talk about the current state of collecting for PlayStation 3, the current market prices, where they are now, where they were before, and where I see them going. If you're not aware, there was recently a very big shift in the prices for PlayStation 3 games. I'm sure a lot of you know why that was. However, I have a slightly different take on certain aspects of why the games went up in price, and it doesn't solely have to do with the announcement of the PlayStation Network stores, you know, closing, which ended up not happening. But we're going to get into that. We're going to discuss things like which games and what types of games you should be kind of honing in on now, which ones I feel will probably never come back down, which ones I feel like you should be waiting for, and I think they will come down in the future. You know, where do we see this going, and where am I basing my ideas on? Where am I basing my future predictions on? Well, I browse a lot of eBay these days, right? I do live streams of eBay once a week, minimum 5 or 6 hours, and I see the trends, right? We watch every week for hours. We look at prices of games, and we see this happening week by week. I can follow the prices of games. Are they coming down? Are they going up? Which games are like nearly impossible to get? Which games have plenty of supply and might come down in the future? And I think this is way more accurate, obviously, than checking something like price charting and game value now and sites like that, because, well, they're usually pretty delayed. They're not always very accurate. It's much better to just go on eBay, check completed sales, and see in real time, day by day, what games are selling, what games aren't selling, what they're selling for. So I'm going to use a lot of my knowledge from spending countless hours over the past, well, several years that I've been doing eBay game hunting streams. But of course, most recently, the past month or so, after what I like to call the PlayStation apocalypse or PS apocalypse, PlayStation apocalypse. I have all different terms for it, is what I refer to when I talk about this sudden boom in PS3 prices. So let's start from the beginning here. How did this happen? Maybe you're not familiar with what actually happened to cause this sudden increase in prices. Now, a lot of people have always said, collect for the Xbox 360, collect for the PS3 now. They're nice and cheap. They're easy to get the games. That was a fairly common recommendation that people would give, because for a long time, games on the PS3 were very cheap. However, this year, several weeks ago, I forget the exact date, Sony announced that they would be shutting down the PlayStation Network store for PlayStation 3 and, of course, Vita, but for this video specifically, we are focusing on the PlayStation 3. And this caused a lot of panic for collectors, not even just collectors, but just casual gamers. And suddenly, the YouTube videos started popping up, buy these games now, get these before it's too late, all these recommendation videos, and it wasn't even completely people buying. A lot of people say that the prices went up because the PlayStation Network in particular was going down. I think that's actually a fairly minor point in the price increase. Because if you think of it this way, people that were going to buy games on the PlayStation Network to begin with probably didn't care too much about owning the physical version of that game. Now, yes, there are some circumstances where owning the physical copy, you'll be able to patch the game, for potential bug fixes on the PlayStation 3 before the PSN Network went down. And there was a lot of conflicting reports and opinions on, if the PSN Network went down, would you lose the ability to patch these games, yada yada. But in my opinion, if you think about it, take a game that's available on PSN. Whoops, knocking my camera on here. Take a game that is available on PSN and somebody that planned on buying it, and then suddenly they find out that it will no longer be available. Why would they rush out and buy the physical version, right? Instead of just getting the digital version before it got pulled down. So my take on it is mostly the tidal wave of price increase was mostly just due to hype, right? More recognition on the PlayStation 3. All this new attention drawn to the PlayStation 3 caused people to just be like, wow, this is the time. I got to collect PS3 right now. Everybody's talking about it. I'm getting hyped up on games that I played, over a decade ago. I remember playing that game at my friend's house. Let's get that now. It wasn't so much the digital game closure. That's a whole separate entity, right? Like games that are exclusive to the PSN, that's completely different than games that are on PSN and also available physically. So I think it was the hype, the excitement, the fear of missing out, right? I feel like the fear of missing out in this case is the fear of missing out on ever getting this game cheap ever again. So games were getting snatched up. I saw it happening. Games were getting snatched up so fast that you would go on eBay for most of these games and there would be absolutely no copies available anymore. So people were just buying games simply because they didn't want other people buying the game before them and then making it pretty much impossible to get a copy anytime soon. And of course, the way that video game prices and collecting go now, prices can rise and fall so quickly and spike overnight, like literally overnight, that a lot of people were just like, all right, this is it. I got this stimulus check. I got a bunch of extra money that, I can just blow on something right now. I'm going to go and I'm just going to load up on every PS3 game that I possibly think I'm going to want in the future. Right now, even though I have no intention of playing these games, I'm going to go on and just buy everything at their current market price because I fear in the future they're going to be way more expensive because they saw what happened with the N64. They saw what happened with the PlayStation 1, the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation 2. They see these trends of pretty much every console that preceded the PS3 and they're like, I don't want to be in that situation again. I want to be able to collect as affordably as I can. Yeah, I'm going to pay a little bit more now, as this slight spike is happening, but I hope it doesn't spike more in the future. So that's the general thing that happened. However, what ended up happening was Sony saw all this hype going on around people kind of upset that the PlayStation Network was closing. Like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, we're not going to shut it down. Thank you for your support. Thank you for all the fans and the outcry around, us wanting to keep the PlayStation Network store up. Enjoy. We're not taking it down. Free publicity for them. Kind of crazy, right? I mean, look at all the news and attention and articles and YouTube videos that they got for just saying, we're shutting it down and, actually, no, we're not going to shut it down. Maybe it was planned. Probably not, but you never know. Anyway, so that's the long and the short of it. But what this and other announcement where they'd be like, oh, guess what? We're not shutting it down. There was a decrease in prices for some games. However, I don't think that decrease is fully attributable to the fact that they said we're no longer closing it. I think that mostly had to do with the fact that a lot of the games that people were buying were actually quite common, but there's plenty of a supply out there, right? So once the initial stock of these games, take the Ratchet and Clank games, for example, right? Certain Ratchet and Clank games were spiking. The Ratchet and Clank future games, they were between Crack in Time and Tools of Destruction. Tools of Destruction was capping out at like $50. Crack in Time was up to like $70, $80, right? These are not rare games. Yes, there's a new Ratchet and Clank game coming out soon. I'm sure that's a factor too, but these games suddenly started to come back down over time, and now you can get Tools of Destruction if you're, a little bit patient. You can get it for $20, $25. You can get Crack in Time for $40, $35 or so, right? So the prices are steadying out because people are seeing, oh my goodness, look at how much my PS3 games are worth. Practically everybody that has a PlayStation 3 collection owns these games, and I know I'm just using Ratchet & Clank as a example here, but there are many others, and they start listing them, right? They list them, the market gets flooded again, there's plenty of copies, all the people that were willing to spend these big spiked up prices, they got their copies, and the people that were like, I can't spend that, suddenly there's copies appearing more and more, prices are coming down, people are undercutting. Another example, MotorStorm Pacific Rift. That game was topping out at $60 during the PS Apocalypse, and now that game is readily available again for around the price spike prices, which is around $35, $40 on the higher end. It's coming down gradually back to where it was because it's generally not considered a rare game. There was usually always a ton of them available, right? So it's coming back down. So my point in all this is, which games should you be waiting for, right? So any game that is deemed common, even if it's an exclusive, but if it is a common game that always had tons of copies on Amazon, always had tons of copies on eBay, and if it doesn't fall into certain genres, this is very important, right? We're going to get into the genres. It's going to be a little bit of a long-winded video, but I hope you guys appreciate this deep dive into my thoughts on the situation of PS3 right now. And by the way, if you have any suggestions for videos like this where you want me to take a really in-depth look at certain aspects of collecting for certain consoles or anything like that, just leave a comment below, and who knows, maybe I'll pick your idea for a future video just like this one. But I think any third-party game, right? But before we get to that, before we jump ahead to that, actually, let's talk about, because this ties into it, let's talk about why people choose to collect PS3 over 360, especially when it comes to multi-platform games that are available on both consoles. So why are certain PS3 games way more expensive than 360 games? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that people are devoted to their favorite console, right? And for a lot of people, they grew up with a PlayStation. They didn't grow up with an Xbox, right? Because PlayStation as a brand predates Xbox. Pretty easy to understand that, right? So a lot of people, when they collect, they specifically collect PlayStation 1, 2, 3. So when they have a collection on their wall and they want to show it off, what looks cooler? A set of PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 games all lined up, or PlayStation 1, 2, and Xbox 360? It's the PlayStation 3, right? So despite a lot of these PlayStation 3 games actually performing worse, they tend to have worse performance, usually. I'm just generalizing here, but usually they tend to have more performance issues because typically they are ports of a 360 version. They tend to only run in 720p, whereas a lot of times the 360 versions will run in 1080p. There are exceptions where certain versions run way better on the PS3 and way worse on the 360. But in general, the 360 versions are regarded as the better versions. And even crazier, PS3 games are, unlike a lot of Xbox 360 games, not backwards compatible on a current gen console. You can take a game like Final Fantasy 13 on the Xbox 360 and arguably turn it into the most beautiful and best version of the game on an Xbox One or an Xbox Series X, because they actually make the cutscenes look amazing in that version if you play it on backwards compatibility, whereas the PS3 version is pretty abysmal when it comes to performance comparatively, right? Like, it's not like a broken mess, but an example, right? And both of those games are kind of around the same price. Actually, some of the Final Fantasy 13 games, especially 13-2 and Lightning Returns, actually saw a decently little not big, but a decent little chunk of price increase during this whole ordeal. But yeah, it comes down to brand, right? It comes down to genres. Horror as a genre is really big on the PlayStation, right? Like, people grew up playing Silent Hill on the PlayStation 1. They grew up playing Silent Hill 2 on the PlayStation 2. So the next natural progression is the Silent Hill series is a great example. Why is Silent Hill Downpour suddenly $75-ish when on the Xbox 360 version it's like under half the price? It's all the brand. People equate horror games to the PlayStation brand. So that is why you see games like Splatterhouse, which is nearing $80 to $100 currently on the PlayStation 3, whereas the Xbox 360 version is around half that, even though that is increasing, and I do feel like that game will continue to increase despite not being backwards compatible. But games like Alone in the Dark, Inferno, right? The PlayStation 3 version, of course it's a slightly updated version, is suddenly way more expensive than the Xbox 360 version. However, this leads me to another point, and I know I'm jumping around here, and Alone in the Dark is a good example. That brings me to my next bullet point. I also feel like the price increase for a lot of PS3 games is complete manipulation. Okay, what do I mean by this? A lot of the price increases are not determined by the community as a whole. This is my take on it, okay? This is my personal take on it. Obviously it's hard to have concrete evidence for this, but this is what I feel like is going on, and I feel like a lot of people in the back of their minds know something like this is going on. I did a stream about 2 weeks ago or so, week and a half, 2 weeks ago, where I was checking PS3 prices, and I said, let's check out what's going on with Alone in the Dark Inferno. And I looked, and I'm like, yep, sure enough, one of the most hated modern survival horror games is still nice and cheap. Tons of copies available, tons on eBay, $10 to $15, right? Literally overnight, every copy disappears, and the only copies that are left are $40+ copies. What happened? Why didn't Alone in the Dark Inferno sell out during the big boom, right? When, in general, all the PlayStation 3 games started getting expensive all around the same time. Why wasn't Alone in the Dark as a horror game part of that? Well, it missed the radar initially for manipulation. Now, you could say, yes, maybe there was a big YouTube video that popped up that talked about the Alone in the Dark series. I don't know. I didn't look into these things too deeply, right? There's so many YouTube videos out there now. Maybe it was a bullet point in somebody's top 10 PS3 games you need to buy now. Who knows? But I feel like this does happen, and I'm just using Alone in the Dark as an example. I'm sure there's plenty of games this happened to that are not part of the horror genre. So what I think goes on is There may be one person, there may be a couple people, it may be a group of people that work in tandem. Typically, I think it's one or two, pretty wealthy people that invest into video games, right? Look at what's happening to trading cards. Look at Pokemon cards, right? People are investing into video games. So they see a game like Alone in the Dark, they're like, wait a minute, this is a survival horror game on a PlayStation console that's still available for $10 to $15, while all these other games are going up in price. Like, not so Magus is $100 plus on the PlayStation 3. How is Alone in the Dark still only $10? Right? And they see it's like a little exclusive version, so there's a reason why people would want to buy it in terms of like updated camera and whatnot. And you just get one person that's like, man, I got $200-300. Let's just blow out eBay. Let's buy up every single copy that's available. Let's hit up Amazon, clear it out. Get on Mercari, clear out, pretty much make it impossible, bottleneck the market, pin it down for Alone in the Dark. Any copy that appears for sale, you snatch it up. Any cheap copy you see, you snatch it up. What does that do? It forces people to buy the expensive copies. You get somebody that's desperate, money's not too much of an issue. They come on, they see there's no copies available. The only copies that are available are double, triple the price of what they used to be. They're like, whatever, I'm just going to buy it. They buy it. People check the sold listings. Other sellers check the sold listings. They see somebody bought that game for $40 or so. And they're like, okay, this is no longer a $10 game. This is now a $40 game. Everybody starts listing at $40. That person that snatched up every copy gradually lists them over and over, and they're making big bank, right? It's manipulation. I really do feel this, and it's not just the PlayStation 3. This happens a lot with a lot of other consoles as well. And I know these are some hot takes. I'm also not placing blame on anybody. This has absolutely nothing to do with a video, in this case, of what I'm explaining. This is just one sole person hanging out. They got a lot of free time, one or a couple of people. They're like, let's just make this an expensive game. Let's invest in it a couple of years from now. I'll see what happens with the price. A year from now, let's dump all my copies and make some profit. I really feel like that's what's going on with the collecting hobby. That's a whole nother topic to get into. We're not going to go into that too deeply, but I do feel like that is a big contributor to what is happening here. So once again, not blaming any people that make content that can correlate to increases in prices. I think this is just people that have no content creation background at all. They don't have a YouTube channel. They have no influence on any of that. They're just like, let's do it, right? So this brings me to my next point, what I like to call the Holy Trinity, the three select that were chosen. And it's kind of funny when you actually look at the PlayStation 3 library and exclusives. There's not a whole lot of good, like decent PS3 exclusives that you can only get on that console physically, right? So that brings me to the Trinity, as I like to call them: Folklore, Puppeteer, and 3D Dot Game Heroes. These games, for the most part, with the exception of maybe 3D Dot Game Heroes, even though for a long time that game was pretty not that hard to find, right? They were chosen, they were selected to be expensive for no other reason than being in certain genres, and for looking cool, and for generally being well regarded, right? So when this whole big boom was happening, the people that either manipulate prices or, sellers that can kind of catch on to the trending sales of games, or just people that, and I kind of include myself in this because I do a lot of price predictions and I tend to have a pretty high accuracy in terms of predicting future prices of games. I can look at a game like Folklore and be like, yeah, in the future, this is going to be one of the more expensive PS3 games. And I, as well as many other people, definitely called that one out. It's a pretty obvious one, right? It falls into that sort of unique niche of being a fantasy action game with light horror, or dare I say, horror adjacent elements. It kind of has, little quirks like the 6-axis controls with pulling souls out of the enemies, right? It's a neat little exclusive game that you can't play anywhere else. It doesn't, it doesn't do anything exceptionally crazy, but it's a game that you can only play on the PlayStation 3. It has this sort of like anime-esque fantasy, high fantasy horror look to it. That's all it needs. Guess what? You're selected. You're one of the few games on the PlayStation 3 deemed worthy of being one of the chosen ones, simply because of the genre that you fall into. People just pick those games, like Puppeteer, right? A super common game. That game never used to be rare. There were a dime a dozen. You couldn't even get rid of that game for $10. But because Puppeteer just so happens to be pretty much one of the only, new IP platformers on the console that you can't get anywhere else. There are other 3D platforms on the PS3. There aren't many, though, outside of course, the big ones like Ratchet and Clank. But Puppeteer is just sort of this game where it's like, well, there's not much else to choose from. Let's just pick that weird little cute 3D platformer over there. Okay, let's make it $100 because people will pay it. People will pay the price, right? Because they want to play the exclusives that are somewhat well regarded and fall into certain genres. 3D Game Heroes. I mean, do we need to say more, right? I mean, Zelda-like. It's generally well regarded as a Zelda clone. It's got that anime feel to it. It's a pretty cool game. There's nothing else like it on the PlayStation 3, and people are just like, okay, that's it. We're picking that one too. We're making it expensive. We don't care how common this game was or what. And that brings me into my next point. Common, right? So what do you do about common games that are going up in price? Which ones will actually come back down and which ones won't? I fully feel like Folklore, Puppeteer, and 3D Game Heroes, they are coming down, right? Their prices were spiking well over 100. They were anywhere between 100 to 130-ish typically when this first started happening, and they are coming back down. Copies are sitting unsold for, generalizing here, anywhere between 80 and 90-ish dollars. So the prices are coming down on the Holy Trinity. However, I don't think they're going to come down too much more over time, right? Because we as collectors, we are drawn, once again speaking generally here, we are drawn to expensive games, right? We equate money to, oh, that must be a good game, or the status of your collection. You need that expensive game because it's expensive. It costs money. And having a game that costs a lot of money in your collection, there's sort of like a dopamine hit from having that game in your collection for a lot of people. So, these games are going to remain expensive because people are willing to pay those prices. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, the PlayStation 3 is still very cheap to collect for compared to other consoles, right? So who's to say that somebody that's willing to pay $500 for Kuon or $500 for Ruler Rose on the PlayStation 2, why wouldn't they pay $60, $70, $80 for Folklore? Why wouldn't somebody that pays, Klonoa on the PlayStation 1 is nearing $1,000 these days. It's like between $600 and $800. Why wouldn't they pay $60, $70 for what's considered to be another good PlayStation brand exclusive platformer like Puppeteer? You see what I'm getting at here? So there's an endless supply of people that are going to be willing to open up their wallets and buy these games. And that is why certain common games like Puppeteer, arguably Folklore, somewhat 3D Game Heroes, I'd say that's a little bit more uncommon these days, but you get what I'm saying. They're always going to be ready and willing to pay. There's no reason for these games to come back down to their pre-PS-Pocalypse prices. So those are the kind of games that I would recommend not waiting too long on, but still be patient, right? See where the prices are going. Once you see the prices start to stabilize, that's when you want to buy. They're still kind of fluctuating. They're still coming down. So don't be in a rush. Don't feel like these games are going to sell out and you're never going to get them again. Also, don't feel like they're going to spike in price. There's no way these games are going to spike way up in value anytime soon unless they gain some kind of like huge notoriety, right? Let's say a Puppeteer 2 suddenly gets announced, Folklore 2, 3D Game Hero, whatever that, 4D Game Heroes, you know what I mean? Then maybe they go up. But for now, don't worry about those too much. Let's talk a little bit about horror again. Horror. And this can be it's a whole video by itself, but let's just touch upon here. Horror will not and never come down, okay? Horror is like in a different echelon. It's in a different level from other genres. Games like Splatterhouse, right? That's never going to come down. Games like Silent Hill Downpour, unless that gets some kind of HD remaster at some point or a Silent Hill collection, and God forbid that we get a new Silent Hill game. If we get a new Silent Hill game, every Silent Hill game, and not just the PS3 games, are going to spike. So I'd actually advise you to look into, unless you're kind of playing your cards and you're like, I think there's going to be an HD port, I would advise you, if there's a Silent Hill game on the PlayStation 3 that you want, you get it now, because there's been so many rumors over the last year or two about Silent Hill coming back in some way or some form, and if that happens in any way, you're going to see a huge spike in prices on this series. It's already happening with Silent Hill 1, 2, 3, and somewhat 4 to some extent. So don't wait too long if you're a fan of Silent Hill. And look at Alone in the Dark, right? That ain't coming back down. I've seen it happen with other horror games. Once a horror game goes up in price, it only continues to trend up. What's my evidence for this? My years of watching and looking at games on eBay. Anytime I see a horror game and I see it start to go up, it never really ever comes back down. It's just the genre. It's just how it goes. I mean, I can do a whole nother video on horror games alone and why that is, like the mentality behind that. But for now, we're just going to recommend, if there's a horror game you want now and it's still relatively affordable, you should probably get it. All right. So what about the multi-platforms, right? What do you do about games that are, on both consoles? Do you wait for the price to come down or what? I say you wait. Look at games like El Shaddai, right? Why is the PS3 version so much more? It's on 360 and arguably has a slightly better performance. Why is the PS3 version, $80 to $100, and the 360 version is like still what, 20, 30? I think it's still kind of sitting around. Once again, it's the brand. People that are collecting these unique games that they missed out on all those years ago, they're coming back, but they only want it on PlayStation. However, eventually people are going to break, right? Eventually, and I see this happen with other games. An example would be for, say, on the GameCube, just a random example that comes to my mind. Automodelista, GameCube version was getting very expensive, $100. People are like, I ain't paying $100 for Automodelista. So they're like, let's look at the alternatives. They see it's much cheaper on, say, the PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 version at the time was like $10. They start migrating over to buying the PS2 version because it's way more affordable. Pretty much the same game. They're like, listen, I'm just going to have to deal with the fact that I don't need every game on the brand that I like, PlayStation. Let's get it on, or in this case, GameCube. Let's get it on the PlayStation just to try it out. It's much cheaper. Price starts to gradually go up. Another example, another racing game, Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast. The Xbox version was getting exceptionally expensive for various reasons compared to the PS2 version, which has a slightly worse performance. PS2 version used to always be cheap. Xbox version was well over $100. PS2 version was at the time around 20, 30. PS2 version is now starting to approach the original prices of the Xbox version because, once again, in my opinion, people are migrating to the more affordable version. So I do feel like that will happen with the PS3, right? Not everybody can afford an $80, $100+ game just because, they collect for PlayStation. Some people can afford to buy those versions. Not everybody can. So everybody that's like, man, I really want to play El Shaddai, they're going to eventually get it on the 360. This is going to start causing the really high price spikes on these multi-platform games that aren't actually all that rare. There's actually a lot of copies of El Shaddai out there, believe it or not. They will gradually come down. They're not going to crash in price, but they will come down. I can see El Shaddai and PS3 comfortably starting to sit somewhere around like the $60-ish, $65 price range, maybe $70, around there, like give or take, in due time, which is way cheaper than the $100+ it was going for, right? 360 version will kind of start to even out. You're going to see the 360 version go up as the PS3 version comes slightly down. The PS3 version will always be slightly more, but the 360 version will go up in price as they start to sort of like balance out the different types of collectors that are out there, if that makes sense. So multi-platforms that I don't think will ever come down are the genuinely rare multi-platforms, okay? An example of this is one that I personally noticed. Blades of Time was one that I saw where it is on a 360, it's on the PS3, but for whatever reason, the 360 version of that has a very small print run. There's really not a lot of copies available at any given time. Heck, a lot of people don't even know that game exists at all on any version. So games like that where there's not too many copies to go around and it kind of caters to the hardcore collectors that are, once again, always going to have their wallets open, ready to go, $100, whatever, take it. I need it for my collection, because generally maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 or so pop up a month. Those are the kind of games that will remain expensive despite being multi-platform. When it comes to games that are exclusive to the PlayStation 3 but are kind of like in that weird, like, uncommon realm, not exactly rare. So a good example of this is White Knight Chronicles 2. Not really a rare game. However, you got to keep a lot of factors in mind, right? It's an RPG developed by Level 5, so, Dark Cloud, Ni no Kuni. It's actually 2 games in one, an RPG that you can only play on the PlayStation 3, stuff like that. These are factors that you have to look into, right? So a game like White Knight Chronicles, where there aren't a ton of exclusive RPGs on the PlayStation 3, will probably not really ever see a price decrease ever again. Will it come down a little bit? Sure. But now that there's all this new attention on the PlayStation 3, the market has seen a price increase. So when people look at price history, once a couple of months pass and you can't exactly just go on eBay and look at purchases from many months ago, people will go on price charting, people will go on Amazon, they will see that copies of this were selling for $40, $50-ish, and they're never really going to have a reason to slash the prices too much as long as the demand is there. And I do feel for RPGs, the demand will be there. As bad as the RPG is, for example, Time and Eternity, yes, a game that is not very well regarded, but it is a very unique experience, and it is only an RPG experience that you can have on the PlayStation 3, and it does have its fans. It has its unique quirks with the Yuzo Koshiro soundtrack, the super janky animations. Like, there's an audience for this, right? We see this. There's so many mediocre, janky RPGs released these days where people don't care if it's got an anime girl running around in a mini skirt, blasting monsters and making jokes and whatnot, and just having a good soundtrack. People are going to buy it. They don't care how bad it is these days, whether or not it's just going to sit on their shelf and look good for that video game collector clout, or they're actually going to give it a try and be like, man, I just wasted a ton of money on this. There's a collector out there for everything these days, right? So we're kind of like going back into the genre of things because we are talking about RPGs a lot here, but there are certain other games though, like Lair, right here, as you can see in the back here. I am a pretty big, I put off playing Lair for a long time, and I eventually finally played the updated controller version where you can play it with a joystick instead of 6-axis. And man, it's actually a really good game, I have to say. Factor 5 did a great job on that game. A little hard. The only reason I never finished it, one of the missions was just too difficult, but man, what a cool game. However, a game like that, right? Lair, Motorstorm, Heavenly Sword, these games have such high print runs and just not enough demand despite being exclusive, right? It will probably take 5, 6, 7, 8 years before these games start seeing any kind of drastic price increase because there's just so many copies floating around out there. It doesn't matter how hard somebody tries to try and manipulate the market or what. There's just so many that people will always be flooding these games back into the market. There's too many out there to fully get a grasp and control on games like this, despite being exclusive, even if they're really well regarded, like a game like Heavenly Sword, which generally it's got a pretty big fan base. A lot of people really like that game. I think it'll kind of hover around that mid-range, like 15 to 25, maybe 30 tops as it flops back and forth in due time. But I just really never see Heavenly Sword getting too high up there. There's just too many copies available. So games like that, you kind of have to use your better judgment. And if you're ever not sure on a game where you're like, man, I'm really not sure what's going to happen to the price of this game, come ask me. Come ask me directly. Come to one of my streams, just pop in and be like, Pete, what do you think about this game? Do you think the price is going to go up on this? Do you think it's going to go down? And I'll do my best to kind of give you my take on it. Should you buy it now? Should you buy it later? You're always free to come in and ask me. No problem at all. So just kind of flip-flopping back and forth here again. Games that I think will continue to come down. I do think the Ratchet and Clank games will come down. I don't think you need to panic buy these games. Like I said, as people are noticing what their PS3 games are worth, they're taking these games that are common, like the Ratchet & Clank series, with the exception of some like Into the Nexus, some of the later print ones that are generally actually kind of uncommon. Those might not see too much of a drop, but in general, you're going to see these games continue to fall, especially if they ever do some kind of HD compilation with some of the PS3 like future games. You'll definitely see a pretty big fall in those. But yeah, I didn't want to ramble on too long. I'm trying to think. I do this all off the cuff, by the way. I have a little tiny bullet list here of just a couple things, so I didn't forget them. But I did this whole video off the top of my head, so I'm sure there's something that I wanted to talk about and completely forgot. And I know I ramble and go all around sometimes, but it's just how I like to do videos, right? No scripts, just go for it. Get the hot takes in there, because a lot of times when I sit down and just talk like this, a lot of other things come to my mind, and I just find it better to do that way. So PS3 collecting in a nutshell: it's expensive, yes. Be patient. always check sold listings, because sometimes you'll notice a game where suddenly you see a copy sell for a pretty big price, and then you go and check, and you might be able to get a cheap copy relatively quickly. That's what actually happened to me. Hey, I'm not an angel either, right? I fell victim to that fear of missing out mentality. I bought a couple of PS3 games that were multi-platform, right? Like I panic bought Wet because, well, the game is pretty well regarded. It seems kind of unique for the third-person shooter genre, and I'm like, let's just get this, right? And I will admit I bought the PS3 version because I fell for it, right? I'm a PlayStation fan. I wanted the PS3 version. I had that fear that it's going to be really expensive in the future, and I kind of just wanted it for my PS3. You know, no shame. I wanted it for I'm one of those people. I contribute to the problem. But you know, I also bought Alone in the Dark Inferno, but that was the case of me going on eBay, noticing one day that a copy had sold for like 35 bucks, and I'm like, what the heck? Quickly scoured the internet and probably found the very last copy that I can get for about $17, and no more. You can't get that game cheap anymore. So yeah, I fell victim to it too. You know, first-hand experience, and I was eyeing certain games that I hadn't bought yet, and I'm like, should I pull the trigger now? And I'm really lucky that I waited, because some of those games are coming down. Some of them are not. But yeah, just feel it out. See what happens to the prices. Don't panic buy anything right now, right? Like, just the chances of any of these games actually going drastically up in price, I think that only goes to a few games like Painkiller, Hell and Damnation, and Africa, right? Like, actually genuinely, or Rain, right? The English physical copy of Rain. The actually really rare physical copies of games that are very hard to come by. I think those are the only games that you need to sort of panic about. And of course, the horror games, okay? So if you have to take something away from this video, if you're a horror fan, you're probably better off buying your horror games now rather than later, especially as we get closer to October. And if you're a big pocket spender of really rare games, you're probably better off buying something like Africa or Hell and Damnation and stuff like that sooner rather than later. One more I wanted to touch on, I almost forgot it, because the price is also going crazy for this game. Majin and the Forsaken Kingdom. Wait on that game, people. Wait on it. First of all, I played that game. I thought it was kind of cool for the first few hours, and then it got really puzzle heavy, like too puzzle heavy for my taste, and I kind of lost interest in it. It was this kind of cool, chill, relaxed platformer in the beginning, and it just kind of lost me as it got really slow and puzzly. That game is going for big bucks. It's readily available on the 360. So I think as people want to try that game, like I mentioned earlier, price will come down a little bit on PS3. Price will start to go up a bit on 360 and kind of even out with once again the PS3 version being more expensive. But wait on that, people. That's a product of just hype, right? YouTube hype creating the illusion that you have to have this game in your collection. The market gets bought out. There's quite a bit of copies floating around out there for that game, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure there's plenty of copies of that on the PS3. And once people start to like list their copies or play the game and be like, yeah, this wasn't for me, let's try and make some of my money. Just be patient, okay? Just be patient. Anyway, what a world we live in now to be a retro or just a general video game collector, right? Like, wow. It's like the Wild West out there. Anyway, if you have any comments or stories to share about your time collecting PlayStation 3, I'd love to hear it in the comments below, or pop into one of my streams on Twitch and love to chat about it, or stop by every Saturday. I do an eBay stream. We check what games are selling for. We typically check in on PlayStation 3 games so we can kind of keep up with the market price. I'd love to see you there, as well as everybody else in my community, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and like I said, any recommendations for videos like this, deep diving into the mentality of game collecting these days? Post it in the comments below and let me know. See you guys in the next video.